were built for, that they had about human beings and what could be achieved, what could be accomplished, to even imagine. The imagination, uh, I mean, even comes before the accomplishment of great things like that. So it's the great structures, but it's also the practical organization of the society, where they had, like, at the root of the society was to build character in classical Africa, for example, because you see the wisdom texts or the books of wise instruction. And the first book ever written in the history of the world was written by Ptah Hotep. So Ptah Hotep wrote the first book 4,400 years ago in Kemet, or so-called ancient Egypt, and he wrote 37 lessons on ethical and moral conduct. Those That book of wise instructions with 37 lessons, Ptah Hotep is teaching about character, and character means to build. And he's teaching the great lessons of how do you make sure that your name goes forth and not have your name as a foul odor. There's nothing worse than a foul name, because you know your name and your reputation precedes you. But Tep is telling people to avoid that. He's writing about how do you respect your elders, how do you avoid conflict, how do you stay in and out of the courts, and how do you listen well, because the wise person is one who listens well. And the most common verb that's used in the African wisdom text, Tep, Kajimni, Amenemope, so many great writers in antiquity, they're writing about the word in Medu Neter or hieroglyphs, the most common verb that was used, the one you see throughout these texts, long before the books of the book of Proverbs, long before the Songs of Solomon. You have these wisdom texts that are much older, and the most common verb is sejum, and we translate sejum as the verb meaning to hear or to listen. That is the most common verb you see, and they associate, the African ancestors associate wisdom with listening and hearing well, and this is at the root and foundation of the cultural practices. So people were expected to do the right thing and to do right things, and the institutions were all set up in order to guide and direct behavior. It wasn't a court system based on money and corruption. No, people were expected to think, do, and act all the time the right way, and to make sure that that becomes an intuitive part of their character. So when we look at the early African high level civilizations that go far back into antiquity, more than 5,000 years, we look at the cultural practices. We can see it in the paintings, in the reliefs, the statues. We also see it in the text that we're dealing with harmonious societies that were able to work out many problems that we're faced with today. So we look towards African culture for solutions. Now, look, I'm totally clear, and most of us who've been around, we know that one of the things that has been very popular in the U.S., particularly in the 1990s when it really took off. Um, uh, in fact, it was in the 80s, and then it really took off in the 1990s, and that's the rites of passage programs around the country. So it was a rite of passage where older brothers would help to mentor the young boys into manhood, and the older sisters and women would mentor the young girls into womanhood. This didn't come about because of some creative thinker or some mind of one person who just created it. No, this is a fundamental part of African cultural practices that is rooted in the society. So these initiation rites are not just for youth to become adults. There's actually five rites. There's a rite of birth, number one. Number two, the right of becoming an adult. Then it's the right of marriage. Number four would be the right of becoming an elder. And then the fifth one would be the right of becoming an ancestor. These are the five initiation rites that were linked together in a system from birth to death and beyond. So those who understood African culture took the rites of passage idea. They didn't apply all five, but we do thank those who were part of these programs because it was better than nothing. But it's not just the right of becoming an adult. It's a more extensive system that has to be applied. So when I'm doing primary or first-hand research in the field, then this is part of what I'm learning. So for the past 35 years or so, I've been in the field doing primary or firsthand research. And so I'm among the indigenous people in the Omo Valley, in the Nile Valley, going to country after country, speaking with chiefs, speaking with elders, and speaking with people that they call heroes, and also observing the cultural practices, interacting with them, showing them old images from thousands of years ago to get their input, to get their insight. And so I'm learning, but I'm also sharing as I'm out in the field, because documentation beats conversation every day of the week. We can talk. What does documentation provide? And so it's intriguing to be among these people that are still practicing the traditional life ways, and they've worked out these kind of systems because they still have in place the value systems that sustain African culture for quite a long time. I'm talking about the field work that I do in Egypt and Sudan. Now there's current conflict in Sudan. We can't go right now, but done a lot of work there, and South Sudan and the Omo Valley in Ethiopia. And then the work continues in the Lake Turkana area in Kenya and in Uganda. This is the area that we learn about these ongoing traditional life ways that gives us tremendous insight about how do you organize um, a harmonious culture and maintain the traditional life ways. So that's some of what I
Yeah.
think we need to know as we move forward in 2023, 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put. And something that you speak on too, and it reminded me when you said it, hit me like a ton of bricks. I got into a conversation, of course, when you start talking about history and us being Africans, and somebody always jump in, and he started quoting me things that was more of a recent timeline. you know, uh, Talking about, how Africans or what Africans claim themselves and their thoughts about us, and which is some of the atypical thing that, us modern day African Americans in this country would talk about. And, he was quoting me more recent things. And you spoke about the importance of a timeline. When you start talking about history, when and what point in time are you speaking on? Because Egypt itself, and we know the whole continent was colonized, you got to put things in the proper perspective. And then at the same time, I want you maybe to speak on the importance and what you got out of being able to travel to most of the top museums in the country, and what are some of the things you saw when you come across that, and any surprises or anything that stand out.
I appreciate the question. When I first started to do the firsthand or primary research, this was back in 1989 and 90. I actually lived in Europe for a year, so I can go to all the major museums, institutes, and libraries in Europe that has stolen African artifacts. Now, this was on my own dime. I mean, I was never broke. I just didn't have any money, but I was driven. So what I learned how to do was to manage a dime. And when people heard about my mission, just out of the blue, people were just sending donations. Plus, my father, because I had a choice to go and do my PhD work or go out in the field and study at Oxford and then do my independent work throughout Europe. So he was sending about $300 a month. And then I made it happen. I was writing book reviews when I was in London, and I got, some speaking engagements here and there, but that sustained me for more than a year. But what I found was this, and this was really pretty amazing. I started out just looking for artifacts to see that the people from Kemet or ancient Egypt and Nubia were African, but I noticed that in museums there was a systematic plot, an ongoing systematic scheme and plot to de-Africanize many of the images. In other words, to systematically not just knock off the noses of statues, but far more devious than that and far more subtle. There are more noses that have been reshaped and recarved that most people will never see, because the modern museum curators and restorers and conservationists and officials, as well as archaeologists and Egyptologists, these are the culprits. We're not talking about anybody in antiquity, because I've documented and photographed and video recording and original excavation photographs. So when a lot of these artifacts and reliefs are first discovered, no issue, no problem, no damage. And then when they're put up in the museum, suddenly they've lost their melanin. So now the statues and reliefs, they've lost the dark paint colors representing the skin tone. And so most people only, when they look at a statue, they only look at the upper body and face because there's so many artifacts around, room after room. They don't look at the legs. So what I began to notice is that there was the systematic de-Africanization, or in other words, the dark legs, colorless face phenomena. That all the paint's going on the face and upper body. You can see traces of it if you're looking for that. And then you see the regular dark brown, reddish brown paint towards the bottom of the relief or statues that most people never notice. The reason why I know that is because not only have I spent thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hours examining the statues from the details that an optometrist would use, but I'm spending time not just looking at the artifacts, but looking at the people who are looking at the artifacts. So I know exactly how they're processing it. So this is what has taken place. Noses have been reshaped. Paints have been stripped. This is not only, so this is when I began to see a devious pattern and document the pattern. So I began to write a series called The Vanishing Evidence of Classical African Civilizations. So I wrote about the vanishing evidence in the museums. Then when I went out and started doing field work in Africa, at the pyramid sites, temple sites, tomb sites, ancient residential sites, then I recognized that this is a much deeper and wider effort to erase or remove Africans from their own contributions and their own ancestors. So I wrote The Vanishing Evidence in the temples area, the vanishing evidence of classical African civilizations in the tombs, and even videotaped and photographed conspirators while they were destroying modern images and erasing the paints. In fact, this goes on. I've even posted some of that on Facebook over about a year ago. People were shocked, completely shocked that in broad daylight, in the open, people have not only destroyed facial features, but then put back remade, recarved features in order to give the image a different racial appearance. How is that done? Somebody might say it's not only the reshaping of nose and lips, the stripping of the paint, but what they do is that they'll just destroy a lot of the face and then remake it. You can tell this remake because it's a different color. They use a different color putty or kind of cement thing. So that's what I began to notice and see as a systematic problem. And that so a lot of the people, they want to claim African contributions, and it's delusions of grandeur. They had nothing.
And that leads me to what I'm about to say, because it's been getting a lot of attention lately, with Kevin Hart. And I remember seeing a video where some of our Arab brothers was just upset, mad that, so-called you black folks coming over there and trying to claim our history. Can we draw a line of distinction between this situation? And it's amazing that we're in 2024 and we still having this argument about the ancient Egyptians being black. That's why it's important for us to know our history, because you would know exactly where the ancient Egyptians got their stuff from, and it was actually to solve the problem. So through language and through things of that nature, you would know. We won't be still having and rehashing this particular argument about what color they was, and you got these Arabs over here, and it's obvious what you say. If you chipping away of noses and things like that, it's obvious that is not your history or culture. Can you speak on that, Doc?
I very much so. This has been one of my areas of specialty. So it's not reading some catalog book and looking at photos. That's fine, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm out in the field, actually making the observations and the assessments and the documentation. So you're totally right. So you got people from Egypt who are claiming without evidence that somehow through some kind of magic, they can transport themselves back thousands of years and claim contributions of Africans. And we know the people in Kemet or ancient Egypt were Africans because the images don't lie. The images are very clear. The language is very clear. The cultural system is very clear. We can go down a long list of evidence that clearly indicates that this is an Africoid people that created the great civilization. The modern people in Egypt, let's be very clear, They did not come. The Arabs that dominate the population did not come until around 640 or 641 of the Common Era. In other words, that is thousands, that's over 1,000 years after the great civilization had already uh,
Yes.
declined and lost its total independence. As the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all these foreigners have come in, and then finally the Arabs come. So the people in Egypt today, there's no connection whatsoever. They come from Saudi Arabia, they come from Lebanon, they come from other places. They're not indigenous to the area. They brought in a completely different, not only racial type, but completely different culture. They had no problem with the Cleopatra movies as long as it was Elizabeth Taylor and white actresses, no problem. But as soon as somebody is portraying Cleopatra the Seventh and has some melanin, and all of a sudden they want to rise up and say history is being distorted, and even take out a change.org petition to try to stop not a documentary or a scholarly work, but a movie, and they lost. So kudos to change.org for stopping them and taking that petition down, because they had no problem with the regular, ongoing, normal misrepresentations and distortions. But to take African culture and then ignore the timeline, ignore the civilization when it was created in the first dynasty over 5,000 years ago, ignore all of that. Um, Ignore the pyramid age where there's one image after another. That clearly these are Africoid people that come from the south. So they didn't just descend from Mars as the Ancient Alien series on the History Channel is presenting. So forget the History Channel and Netflix and this other kind of nonsense. These were Africans that clearly came from the southern part of the Nile Valley. It's one cultural complex, the same culture, same writing system, same similar language system, same pattern of cultural practices. This is well established. And so, but they want to lie. And now they're upset because, you
We're
know,
finding out.
yeah, what we're finding out, and that idea that the people were Arab or white, that's been defeated and destroyed years ago. But they continue with this nonsense. But the only way that they can try to justify it, and it falls short, is to ignore the chronology, or in other words, to ignore the chronological history, where we have to look at it in a sequence. So from the ancient times, when was the civilization established, and look at it in a sequential order. Because if we do that, then we'll find that the people that are claiming that they made these contributions, they came much later. And what happens is that in these, they're not even documentaries that come on the History Channel or Discovery Channel. I call them docudramas. A little bit of documentation, but mostly drama and propaganda. But what they do is totally ignore the timeline, ignore the chronology, and they leap all the way to the end. They leap to the Greek and Roman period and then pass that off as if these were, quote unquote, the ancient Egyptians. Of course they were not. And one other thing we should be aware of is that the scholarly propagandists are very active. They now have the public using a ridiculous phrase talking about the black pharaohs. And they're talking only about the 25th dynasty. A dynasty is a family of rulers. And by them saying the black pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, what they're indicating is that the first 24 dynasties does not have any black pharaohs. So people should be quite aware is that this is made up mental and intellectual gymnastics to get around the fact that they all, going back to the very first dynasty, were African and black. And nobody talks about the white rulers of Greece or the white rulers of Rome. We assume that. We give you that. But at the same time, why did they come up with the black pharaohs? Just total propaganda. Just to get people to thinking that no black people were really around until thousands of years later, when the reality is the case. And this is why it's important to put everything in a proper chronological perspective, starting with Dynasty 1 and going through there. Because if you just looked at Dynasties 1 through 6, and you see the great cultural and historical contributions in architecture and writing, the social organization and engineering, and you look at the images, completely Africoid. But museum after museum and docudrama after docudrama, they leap to the foreign period in order to claim
Yeah.
African contributions.
Right. Before I bring my good brother in, what you said, it also reminds me too about, you know, when you're seeing it on Discovery Channel and all those things. And I remember, coming up in my years that, we have our churches, tend to help promote the negativity, with Africa and even Egypt up until recent times, so a lot of our people don't even look that in that direction, for any type of pathway to understanding spirituality and the good book and things like that. And I find it very odd, they through the movies, they try to always demonize. I seen something when they talk about Amun Ra and they showed this devilish looking thing, what's the interest and why are they trying to take hold, for number one? And number two, they never talk about the spiritual systems, the Ma'at and the 42 negative confessions, that I think people would start maybe doing some critical analysis and putting those two things together, saying that maybe this is a little older, this Bible version is maybe a more newer version of something that our people had back in the day. So I find it very odd that they never talk about the spiritual system or the literature or the spiritual writings that these people were doing. And that would zero you in more so on what was going on if you took the time. But I think they demonized the system on Africa so much and so well that our people don't even look that direction.
Absolutely. That's an ongoing that's an ongoing assault on Africa and our historical and those of African descent and our historical contributions. So we really have to be quite aware of what you said. So that's definitely well stated.
Yeah. All right, we go. I know our brother Vince may be have a few questions for. We're gonna bring him in. He's been sitting on the sidelines, but like I say, brother, I can go back and forth with you all day and tap that brain. But like I said, before I bring him in again, hey, you see, guys, come on out the 16th of March. This is the first part of a two-part series of the Truth series. The 2nd of March, we're going to have my good brother. I'm going to elect to bring the brother back on to help promote the lecture that's going to be on the 16th of March. Right now, we're looking at possibly Dr. Whitaker School on Prospect. I think it's like 2210 Prospect, something to that nature. So come on out around 2 o'clock. We're going to have some sampling of the food as well, West African cuisine after the lecture. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. So come on out. You can, give me a call and I give you the contacts at the end of the show where you can call me and start lining up your reservation. Brother Vince.
Yeah, I have been listening intently to Brother Manu Ampim, and I'm just reminded of some time that I spent with Dr. Runoko Rashidi. I was privileged to be there in 2019 for 2 weeks in Egypt and for a week in the Sudan. And as you said, they're doing what they call restoration, but in the process of restoration, they're changing the complexion of some of the historical figures that you see in the Medu Neter. But I just wanted to amplify the fact that what you said is exactly true. Also, just wanted to talk to you about what we may or may not have done in terms of preserving our history. When you look at Nile Valley civilization, obviously, they did a great job of documenting history because you see it before your eyes. But in some of the other parts of the country, we don't have the records of things that you are uncovering in your work. So I just want you to speak to the importance of the work that you're doing as a primary researcher and the intricacy of what you're revealing in the study of the things that you are looking at.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. That's really the key to what I'm doing. And this and my primary or first-hand research is not an occupation. It's my vocation. It's what I do in life. And I've been, doing the field work now for 3.5 decades. So when I'm out in the field doing the work, I go to 5 different type of locations. I go to pyramids, temples, tombs, ancient residential sites, and museums. And what I've added most recently, I've added doing systematic work in the living communities. So that's why I've been spending more time in Nubia, for example, to really help our Nubian brothers and sisters. And Nubia is in the southern part of Egypt and also northern part of Sudan. But I decided that that wasn't enough. That's important, but I needed to continue to go south. So I have now been spending a lot of time in the field among the indigenous groups who maintain their cultural lifeways in the Omo Valley in Ethiopia, for example. This is a very special region. It's a very, very special region where the cultural practices and ideas they're not impacted very much at all. And one reason is they don't care about anybody else. Each of these more than 40 different groups, they love their group. So they don't care about nobody else. They really don't. And that's important because they don't care what anybody does or thinks. So I spend time among the Morsi, for example, or the Decenage, and to look at the cultural lifeways and and the Kara. I can go down the list, but these and the Karamoja, these very, very important groups, so that my work has taken me there because one of the things that I've done and I realize is that Kemet or Kemetology, as we call it, or Egypt, and people know that as Egyptology. That's important. And then there's ancient Nubia and modern Nubia. People call that Nubiology. But what I coined is Kushology, the study of ancient Kush. But it's not. But Kushology is not only the study of ancient Kush; it's also connecting ancient Kush to ongoing modern practices of the area that represented ancient Kush. So the heartland of ancient Kush was current day Sudan, but it expanded into a very, very large area, not only in Sudan but Egypt, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and across the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. This was the vast part of the ancient Kushite Empire. So, as I was mentioning chronology earlier, but Kush came first, and then Nubia, and then Kemet. That's the historical and chronological order. And it's such a vast area. That's what I've been focusing on is pursuing evidence to learn more about the origins and really pinpoint more about the origins of ancient Kush. The people today in those regions, they know about Kush. They speak about Kush. So, like this summer, I'll be after I lead tours to both to Egypt and Ethiopia, educational tours for 2 weeks. Then I'll be continuing field research in South Sudan. So in South Sudan, they have Kush Airlines, they have Kush Bank, and so Kush is among them all the time and around them, but they don't know about ancient Kush and the details. So that I'm there to learn as I'm learning about the rituals, the ceremonies, the ideas, and the beliefs, but also getting input and insight from elders and chiefs, and then I'll be spending times with some kings as well to learn more about this. But that's a part of the work is to learn the cultural life ways, but it's from the lens of putting together, I believe, the most comprehensive history and understanding of ancient Kush. And this is in the field of what I call Kushology. So this has been the primary research that I've been doing now for, as I said, several decades, but I'm excited about it. And the greatest part of my work, I truly believe, is still in front of me.
Okay. You mentioned chronology, and I heard on another interview that you did going back 200,000 years. I'm really glad that you brought up the idea of the Kushites before Kemet, because we really don't many times go back any further than that. But I also want to pick your brain as a historian, because one of the things that we come up in our conversations about our lineage is this idea of folks being here in America, indigenous Black people, and then we talk about the enslavement process where they transported us from Africa to here. So some folks are saying, "Hey, I ain't African," but then when we look at history, we know that there were migrations of Africans all over the world, and I'm hoping that you can settle the score with respect to this idea that we were here first. I referenced Dr. Runoko Rashidi, and as you know, he worked with Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. They wrote a book called They Came Before Columbus. There are some of our African-centered scholars or Black scholars who are pushing back on that notion. Can you tell us what you know about the travels of Africans around the world, circumnavigation and so forth, and talk about how we as Africans ended up in all parts of the world?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm actually teaching a class at Contra Costa College here in Northern California, and one of the classes is a history of African civilizations, and so I wrote my book on a history of African civilizations to take what I'm teaching out of the classroom and make it available to the community, and so the community can benefit from the book. So it's the first thing that should always be established is the origins of modern Homo sapiens sapiens. There's two sapiens. So modern humanity, those that are anatomically human, is not one sapien, it's two. So we're Homo sapiens sapiens, and it's been pretty well established that we've been around in the East African region since about 200,000 years ago. This has been always speculated based on the early remains that have been found by the Leakey family in like Kenya and that area. But now, since 1987, it's the mitochondrial DNA work of Dr. Rebecca Kahn, Cann. Rebecca Kahn and her colleagues at the University of California at Berkeley, when they did the genetic test, that now has made it definitive that there's one humanity that goes back to a single African ancestor about 200,000 years ago, and so what happens is that eventually Africans migrated out of the African continent. They would have only done that if there were not. They did that because of push factors that pushed them away from the land that they were able to survive and thrive in, where there was plenty of food for because they were hunters and gatherers, but plenty of animals, plenty of plants to pick. There was honey, all kind of things available, but there had to have been a change in the resources available so that they can sustain themselves. The food supply and weather. When those things change and they become scarce or harsh, people migrate. They don't migrate because they just want to explore the world. Nope, there's always push factors. So they were pushed into Europe and also into Asia, and they began to migrate. And when they migrated, and I'll use this term, they differentiated. They became different, or they mutated, because the law is either, when you go to a different environment, the law is either adapt or die. And humanity is very adaptable. So as the weather was different, people had to differentiate. They had to change the hair color, skin, hair type, hair length, and skin, eyes, nose. Everything changed in order to survive in a new environment. So it's pretty clear that Africans were able to leave Africa and go to other parts of the world. This is documented through also DNA work, cave paintings, if you want to look at Australia and places like that. But this would have been people. They didn't even have to always travel by watercraft, because people may not know it, but Australia is an island today. But if you look at the South Pacific and look at the aerial photography, which is called remote sensing, if you look at remote sensing, you can actually see the landmass connecting all of these, what now looks like islands, but they were connected. But when the weather warmed up, the ice in Europe, or in the ice not only in Europe but in the northern hemisphere, when that began to melt, then it raised the seawater and the ocean levels around the world. And when the ocean levels rose, the lower the lower land masses became flooded. So now what we see are the more elevated land masses, or islands. So we know Africans could have walked to Australia 60,000 years ago, no problem. But what we have here, and that's a great question, is we have people who reconstruct the early history of humanity with biased and actually ridiculous ideas. They think, those that write about early history, they think that the oceans and seas were a barrier to travel, when they were never a barrier to travel. The oceans and seas have always been a facilitator of travel. So Africans have clearly gone around the world, and they were certainly here in the Western Hemisphere, North America, Central America, South America, but they were first in South America going back at least 56,000 years ago. This is well established in Pedra Ferrada, Brazil. This has been known since 1986. The work of Professor Guidon and her colleagues. 1986, Pedro Ferrada, Brazil. This is in the Serra de Capivara National Park. But Pedro Ferrada, this is the site where there are human remains, there's artifacts, there's a whole series of paintings and rock art, but there's also been found hearths. A hearth is a fireplace. Nobody uses fire like that, or build a fireplace other than human beings. 56,000 years ago, it's beyond dispute. So we know about Pedro Ferrada, Brazil, and Monte Verde, Chile, that goes back 33,000 years ago. And there's many, and the only way they could have gone to South America first is by boat, by watercraft. They didn't even have to build a great boat because it's the wind, it's the currents that are going to take people from one place to another. It's absurd the way historians and other writers mislead people that somehow people were not ingenious. Yes, they were. They were able to use watercraft and use the oceans and seas as a way to, and it facilitated travel. It wasn't a barrier to travel. So that's one thing to know about when the oldest documented settlement, Pedro Ferrada, 56,000 years ago. But if we look at the first great civilization in all of the Americas, you were referring to that, Brother Vince, and that is the Olmec civilization in Mesoamerica, as archaeologists would call it, but most people call it Central America. To be more specific, current day Mexico. This was the homeland. This is where the Olmec culture was born. This is when we find the emergence of this great Olmec civilization about 3,200 years ago, maybe 3,500 years ago, or in other words, 1,200 BCE, or maybe as old as 1,500 BCE. But clearly, if we look at Olmec, not only the heads of the kings, 17 heads of rulers, 10 tons, 20 tons, 30 tons, but if we look at the monuments, the rituals, the ceremonies, the hieroglyphic type writing system, there's a direct correlation. And the late, great Ivan van Sertima wrote they came before Columbus. And you're right, that brother
Renoco.
Bernardo Rashidi, he also helped to edit some of the work of the Journal of African Civilizations. And there's an issue in the journal dealing with the African presence in early America, where Bernardo and other folks wrote essays and articles to help tell the story. Harold Lawrence and many others wrote, but it's pretty clear that there's an undeniable, definitive African presence in the Americas before slavery and before colonialism. And I remember Van Sertima made a big point, the great late Ivan Van Sertima, that it was that he's the one that stopped the people in this country and other places from saying that Columbus, quote unquote, discovered America. No, he didn't discover. He may have traveled in 1492 and then 3 subsequent voyages, but he definitely didn't discover anything. The people were already here. In fact, Columbus was lost, turned around, cold, and had no idea where he was. In fact, even misnamed the people as Indian. He thought he was near islands of India. This is how disoriented he was. So it's really important that we know that that Africans came to the Americas. They were part of the Olmec society. Van Sertima never argued that all the Olmec were African. He did not. He indicated that the Olmec population, the foundation was Native American, but Africans made a key and crucial and formidable, had a formidable influence and input on the civilization. That's really an important distinction because the enemies of Van Sertima, they lied to try to make him look like he's a scholarly madman claiming all of the Native Americans are Africans. He never did that. So Van Sertima, finally, he wrote, "Reply to my critics." And at that point, the great scholar was upset. So Van Sertima, he went outside of the normal scholarly channels and he said, lie number 1, lie number 2, lie number 3. Usually in academic circles, people are a little bit more polite, but he had enough of the deliberate misrepresentation and the distortion of his scholarship. But it's totally clear that Africans came before slavery, and that's why we can't start our history in slavery. We need to embrace Africa. But if people wanted to stay here in the Western Hemisphere, they certainly have to go beyond 1619 and look at the influence in the great and mighty and formidable Olmec civilization.
That's a great point. And I think it's really critical that we view ourselves not through the lens of an enslavement process that happened over 400 years, but through the lens of our existence on this planet for thousands and thousands of years. You have documented the history in a book called A History of African Civilizations. And I just want to make sure that those who are listening to us on the radio have an opportunity to take advantage of that. So if you're interested in the book, you can go to www.advancingtheresearch.org. Again, that's www.advancingtheresearch.org, and you can get a great copy of this book. And as Brother Antonio has said, we are going to be privileged to have you here in Cleveland next month. And I'm sure we will get more details about that. We're definitely looking forward to that. Also, just want to plug something that is happening at the African American Museum in Cleveland next Sunday and Monday. That's the 25th and the 26th. They're going to be looking at the life of a very historic brother. He was the richest man on the planet. His name is Mansa Musa. You'll be able to come to the museum, and that starts at 3 o'clock next Sunday, the 25th. They're also going to have a program on Monday, the 26th. So, Brother Antonio, we got about 30 seconds before we transition to our online platform. We will be on YouTube and Facebook. You can check us out there, brother.
Yeah, just come on and follow us, and then remember to come on and be a part of what's that? The second, part 2 of this Truth series with my good brother, Brother Ampim. Again, we're going to segue and give me a call, 216-323-6155, 216-323-6155 to attend this Food for Thought event on the 16th of March.
Okay, as always, we'd like to thank our engineer, Tone Harley. And to all of you who are listening and watching, know yourself, love yourself, be yourself. Make today a great day. Peace.
Peace.
Okay, it's 12 o'clock noon, and we are now streaming live to Facebook and YouTube. We'd like to implore you to like, comment, and subscribe. It will help us out tremendously. You can view us on my YouTube channel. You can also view us on Hamtonio's YouTube channel. That is The Journey with Hamtonio on YouTube. And also you can see us on Facebook at the 360 Info Network Facebook page. If you are joining us online, our guest is Professor Manu Ampim. He is the author of A History of African Civilizations. We just heard quite a bit about that publication and the radio broadcast, and we can continue to explore that. But we're going to pick up where we left off, and we were talking about this rich history that we have as Africans all over the planet. We want to lay to bed or lay to rest the idea that there are some of us who are indigenous and there are some of us who are African, and we are different people because truthfully, we're all the same people. Also, Brother Ampim, I would like to applaud you for your passion. When you talked about being in all those places, and again, I heard in another interview that you had enough to last you for 9 months, and you just took that leap of faith and went out there to do what you had to do. And so many years later, you're still at it. Obviously, there is great value to the work that you're doing, and people are willing to support what you're doing. We talked about the importance of illustrating history, and I think it's really kind of ironic that we're having this conversation in a time when there are forces around the world that kind of want to erase history. If you go to states like Florida, where they're banning books, they're banning critical race theory in the institutions of higher learning. Obviously, they do not want us want us to know the truth. When they go through all the trouble of changing the faces and the complexions of those historic monuments to our people on the planet, they are motivated to erase history. Why do you think that they are so motivated to keep us from knowing the truth?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's pretty clear that the folks want to misrepresent and distort the history of the country. They can call it whatever they want, critical race theory, but Dr. King called it the white backlash. He said this is not. He was saying even in the 60s, this was nothing new. That whenever there's progress by Black people, there's always a white backlash. That happened during Reconstruction, for example. After the Civil War, ended slavery, not Lincoln. Lincoln is overrated. But after the Civil War defeated the South in April of 1865, then they began to lie and say that they weren't fighting to maintain enslaved black people, when in fact that's exactly what they were fighting for. Every one of the 11 states, they issued formal documents of why they were joining the Confederate States of America, and it was to maintain the commerce of exploiting black labor by the millions and never paying anybody a dime. And when black people fought in the war, it was 180,000 black men that helped to defeat the South. They're free, but Reconstruction lasted only 12 years, and what Reconstruction was about was to reconstruct mainly the South, because that's where the Civil War was fought, and to try to reconstruct the lives of black people who went from plantation. Some were in the city, but most were in plantations. But they went from slavery to what? They didn't have very much. So this whole period was supposedly to get them a foundation in the floor so that they can integrate and enjoy some freedom and some citizenship in the U.S. But there was a vicious white backlash. That's why the Ku Klux Klan was created the same year that the Civil War ended, in order to keep things as they were. And this has been the case all the way through. There's always been this collective effort by not every single one of them, but the vast number of white people to keep things exactly as they are. So whenever there's progress, there's this vicious backlash. But the other thing is that it's to now try to, as has been done before, to erase the outrageous conduct, to continue dehumanizing black people long after slavery. So you got almost 2.5 centuries of slavery, followed by 100 years of vicious Jim Crow and lynching. So all of this is a great attempt to make sure that this is not taught to anybody, and that this is not taught to young people or anybody else. And that's why they're banning different school districts, and activists are banning books, not only in the schools, banning books in libraries, and banning, now they want to ban movies, but as long as it's promoting white nationalism, no problem whatsoever. So this is the larger issue of what we're dealing with, is to make sure that the history of the U.S. is sanitized, but we won't let them do it. So this is not the first time this has happened on a national level, but back in 2011, for example, this was the 150th anniversary from the founding. I'm sorry, excuse me, from the beginning of the Civil War. So there was a big time commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and then there were propagandists in places like Texas that wanted to just describe the enslaved black people as workers, that these were somehow willing workers, not enslaved victims that had been kidnapped, and in many cases adult napped from Africa, but that they were somehow that they weren't kidnapped. These are just workers. And we thank a parent who saw their child's homework and recognized that this was a completely shameless remaking of history. And there was a debate that broke out at that school, in the school district, and eventually throughout Texas. And then there was a war between the Confederate historians that are still around today that want to sanitize U.S. history and fabricate a clean past that didn't exist, versus historians of honor who were going by the records to know that this is a shameful past. So these propagandists were defeated in Texas. They were defeated around the country back in 2011. So it's just another instance where people are even promoting, as Ron DeSantis would do, promoting, and others promoting black people as just a part of a little something something. It wasn't really that bad approach, and then to dismiss any evidence, any ideas, any studies, or anything about the real history of the U.S. So it's been a shameful history, and it's shameful current practices. The U.S. has bombed black civilians, whether it's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to bomb black civilians in Philadelphia back in 1985. And it wasn't just the Move family. The fire department was on scene back in 1985, and the fire department was told to stand down, let the whole block burn on Osage Avenue back in 1985, just because the police had a problem with the Move family. But why did you destroy the whole block? because they could. And it's normal stuff to just, you know, to blow up and burn up innocent victims and all their properties. But this is what we've been dealing with, and that's why there's a stronger movement around the country now to pay reparations for the stolen labor that America has gained from Black folks, and it's not just individuals. It's not just vicious families that have reaped benefit from exploiting black labor, but there are 5 places in the U.S. Constitution that justify and condone slavery, the slave trade, and the forcing of returning runaway, so-called fugitives. This is baked into the Constitution, which is a flawed document. That people say it's a great document. You can call it that, but it's also flawed because the men that put it together were also flawed. And many of them were slave owners, slave traders, beginning with George Washington, that owned 317 human beings, or where do they want to go? They want to talk about Thomas Jefferson owning 600 victims on his Monticello plantation. And
Whoa.
as a matter of fact, George Washington was so callous. He's on his deathbed in 1799, and enslaved Black folks are still taking care of him on his deathbed. George Washington writes his will because he didn't have one. He writes his will, and he doesn't say that they're free now. No, he says that they can go free, these Black victims, when my wife Martha finishes using and abusing them, then they can go free. But this is what we're dealing with, and this is what people want to erase and eliminate from the history, including Nikki Haley, who on the one hand will claim she's a victim of racism, and then on the other hand said that racism has really never existed in the country. What a contradiction. But this is how common it is to lie and deny what's obvious to anybody.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing too that is interesting. If they clowning us about, the history over here and with some untruths and things of that nature, they really gonna lose their mind, because when you was talking about we could give them Greece a little bit and give them Rome and things like that. But what I think is one of the newest breakthroughs that's going to really send the whole world on his ear, when we start finding out our early presence in Europe, in Ireland, and all the places that they take hold, and we tend to give them by default. But for when they find out about the Jacobites and all the coat of arms and up in Ireland and some of those is Black names and things of that nature, they're gonna lose their mind. That they see that they're a newcomer. That's why they hoard so much of everybody else's indigenous artifacts in their museums. And we can see the pattern here and why they're acting the way they're acting about all the new found info that is coming out, because all you're going to see a lot of the warmongering and a lot of theft and pillage and stuff that has taken place. But they want to tell us that, hey, it don't make our children feel too good about themselves knowing the true American history. But what our kids have to deal with by showing the negative images of slavery and all the exploitations and the films and pimp players, women of the streets, and we see all this Nick Sambo and all of this kind of stuff we see that our kids had to live with and deal with, but we just throw that out the window. Your thoughts on that European, those new discoveries up in Europe? I don't know if you can speak on that at all.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The African influence and early presence in Europe is very well established. Again, we credit different scholars, but we also credit again Dr. Ivan van Sertima. He edited the Journal of African Civilizations, and there was an issue on the African presence in early Europe. And by the way, that journal was published from 1979 to 1994, and the Journal of African Civilizations is arguably the most influential journal in the second half of the 20th century dealing with Black contributions to the world. And the last edition, by the way, was Egypt, Child of Africa in 1994. And I have 2 essays in that last issue published by the late great scholar. But our influence in Europe is we can look at it from various ways, various angles. We can look at the Moors from North Africa. These were African Muslims that occupied Spain from 711 of the Common Era to 1492. Now, from 711 to 1492, that's over 780 years. So it's almost 8 centuries that Africans occupied the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and parts of Portugal. And it wasn't just them occupying Spain and being destructive. They actually, the Spanish may not have liked it, but there were contributions that still are part of Spanish culture, whether it's the architecture, whether it's uh, the book binding, the book making, the book distribution, the intellectual tradition, building universities, the first streets with lights, the first public baths. Even if you look at the cultural angle of the flamingo, you can't talk about the flamingo unless we look at the Moorish influence. And so the Spanish were able to benefit. They also brought map making or cartography into Spain, but this is a formidable influence, and so this is why they just start calling everybody Moors, and then from Moors we get Maurice and Morrison. The original word is Blackamoor. That's the original etymology is Blackamoor. So from Blackamoor we get Moors and Morrison, Maurice. So there's a black relative, there's black family members in that tradition, and then so when the Spanish come here to the U.S., sorry, not the U.S., the Western Hemisphere, they're calling folks Moor and women Mora, and you see it from the Spanish what's called casta paintings, Casta, casta paintings, and the casta paintings were like a race mixing chart. It's amazing how these people bring in racism and racial ideas and a racial stratification. But the cast of paintings, you can see how people are labeled, and we see more and more, for example. But the African influence there is very important. In fact, we can look at not only that, we can look at even in Greece the contributions that the Greeks learned from Africans. For example, we can just take one of many examples, and that we can just take a look at math. And all over the country, high schoolers are misinformed to say that the formula in math, particularly in geometry, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's the square of the hypotenuse. And somehow they call that formula the Pythagorean theorem, named after Pythagoras. But this is odd. This is impossible. Pythagoras lived about 500 before the Common Era. But there's the Amos papyrus. There's the Amos papyrus in the British Museum that was copied by the scribe Amos from an older document to a new surface, to a new papyrus, because papyrus is like paper. Over time, it decays. You have to have acid-free paper if you don't want it to decay. So the scribes would take old documents and then rewrite them because there was no copiers or anything like that in antiquity. So they had to copy by hand. And Amos, the African scribe, signs it at the bottom that he copied a document with 87 advanced mathematical problems with trigonometry, algebra, calculus, geometry without one single mathematical error, and almost copied the knowledge to the current document that he signed, that he faithfully copied it. And it has the so-called Pythagorean theorem. It cannot be called the Pythagorean theorem because it existed more than 1,000 years before his mama even knew him. So if it's going to be called anything, it should be called the Amos papyrus. But in the British Museum, like most institutions, they're great at theft, they're great at robbery, they're great at misrepresenting history. So they call it the Rhind, 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 because the Scotsman, A.H. Rhind, he bought the document in the 1800s. So somehow he gets credit. It's the Rhind mathematical papyrus. No, it's the African mathematical document that predates Rhind, that predates Pythagoras, and it should be called the Amos theorem because he's the one that copies it. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. So this is the kind of credit that needs to be given. So the Greeks, and by the way, Pythagoras didn't lie in his time to say that he's the one that created. Pythagoras was a slow learner. He went and studied for 22 years under African priests. He was a very slow learner. It took him 2 decades to learn this. He leaves Greece not knowing any geometry. There's no teachers of geometry. There's no schools of geometry. There's no books of geometry. He leaves learned from African mathematicians, goes back to Greece teaching something that he didn't know when he left. And then suddenly, well, I shouldn't say suddenly, so he learns, he's teaching them. But the change did not happen until the late 1700s and early 1800s. Only 200 years ago is when a group of scholars in Germany began to rewrite the history of the world. And they turned ancient history upside down and they created the Aryan history. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, no evidence, no proof, but we get the Immaculate Conception of Greece. All of a sudden, it just emerges. No antecedents, no no prior knowledge, nothing. But then all of a sudden, you got the father of history. You got the father of you know geometry and all these other wild ideas. That's why I say documentation beats conversation. So what I say is prove it, sucker, prove it. And they can't prove it because it's just modern propaganda. And the people at the University of Göttingen in Germany are responsible for rewriting the history of the world from around 1790 or so. And they finished this multi-decade propaganda project around 1830. And that's why now Greeks and others are getting credit for African contributions to the world. And I just gave the one example of Pythagoras, but my book, A History of African Civilizations, I give many more examples of unique and profound African contributions to the modern world in arts and sciences, and the arts and sciences in many other areas.
Yeah,
We would be remiss if we didn't talk about our historians, because we've had so many. You mentioned Dr. Ivan Van Sertima and some others. Can you talk about who your heroes are as historians?
Wow. There's so many people that I actually give credit to. I would, give credit to first my mother and father, my late mother, Mama Rosie Jones, and my father, Brother Kofi Ampim. And I really appreciate the foundation that they've given me. And then beyond that, I really thank the mentors that I've had. But in terms of professional historians, the one that has had the most profound impact on my primary research is none other than Walimu Dr. Chancellor Williams. The reason why is because Chancellor Williams, who wrote The Destruction of Black Civilization and the Rebirth of African Civilizations and Second Agreement with Hell, he wrote several books. But Chancellor Williams is special and had a special impact on my work because he actually began to do field work in Africa in the 1950s. And Chancellor Williams did research in 26 African countries and among 105 different language groups. And so he was a tremendous primary or first-hand researcher. So when I read The Destruction of Black Civilization, read the preview, he laid it out as an older historian for younger and future historians to use his model and guideline. So when he went to Europe and studied at Oxford and he was studying in the libraries, I too went to Oxford to study, and I did work in libraries, but I decided to focus on the artifacts in museums throughout Europe. And I went to 11 European countries. I went to East Germany and West Germany. Now they're one Germany combined: Austria, Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Sweden to do original primary research. So I was influenced by the great Chancellor Williams. And there's also so many other scholars that I got a chance to meet and get a chance to know over the years. Ivan Van Sertima, for example, and the great Asa Hilliard, the late great Dr. Asa Hilliard, uh, late great Dr. Jacob Carruthers, and so many other scholars that had an impact on my understanding of these unique African contributions to the world, as well as what work that needs to be done now. And I think the work of Dr. Yosef Ben Jochannan was very important because he's the one, Dr. Ben, he's the one that dragged us back to the Nile Valley. He's the one that made us drink from the mighty waters of the Nile. So before others were going, it was Dr. Ben in the field leading two educational tours a year. It was Dr. Ben that made us respect Nubia. It was Dr. Ben that made us embrace Nubia and look at Nubia as a earlier civilization and even modern culture that's existing now before Kemet. And so we give credit to Ben and Clark and so many others. I also would say this: people may not know as much about Dr. Benjamin Quarles. Dr. Quarles did not focus on Africa, but Dr. Quarles is somebody that was teaching at Morgan State University, where I did my graduate work. And I would meet with Dr. Quarles even after he retired. He had an office in the library, and he would teach me so much about the experience of Black people in the U.S. And he always encouraged me to continue to do my work on Africa. He said that in the early 20th century, they didn't really have a lot of material to learn from and read from, but he encouraged me when I was at Morgan State University. So in Benjamin Quarles, if you want to know about our experience in the U.S., you really have to read Quarles, study Quarles, because he wrote many books like The Negro in the Making of America, for example. But such a great historian. And I do have to credit also the lady that taught me primary research, the late Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, who was one of the pioneers of dealing with Black women's history here in the U.S. And there's many others, but that's a group that I think I should mention now.
You know what, I find it interesting. I was having a conversation with my brother, and we have to realize, for number one, when you start looking at history and you start, getting doctrine and information from a group of people, you got to look at their background, what they're about. And so I think we are finally coming to the conclusion that, and even by this conversation that we're having right now, that the man went out pillaging, stealing, plagiarizing, and things like that. And what you also have to imagine, when I was speaking earlier about some of the things that are untold in this country, about some of the atrocities that they have done, to us here, those things are just coming out because, we all know that there was many other cities like Black Wall Street that they destroyed, that is underwater and things like that. But we also have to imagine in those early explorations to Africa and the colonizations that was going on. Could you imagine how many of these items and relics and reliefs and things like that that's in people's private museums and basements and things like that we haven't seen, that could possibly paint a different picture on what's going on? We have to take that into account. Your thoughts, brother?
Well, there's no question. I think I might have lost a couple things you said, but so if you can repeat that. And then in the meantime, I want to also mention something too that people should, or that I want to mention. And that is the work that I did with the great linguist, Dr. Theophilo Obenga, when he was here in San Francisco area, when he came here in 1999, and he was here until 2008. Every day we went to the library at University of California in Berkeley on a Sunday from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m., 13 consecutive hours every day. We're in the library doing the work. And that was important because, we work very closely together. And, I'm able to work side by side with one of the great scholars in the world and really, learn about his methods, things that I might have known about, but the way in which he taught it and the passion he taught it with, that was stunning. And I was able to share with Doc what I was working on, what I was able to do and document in my research. And he was really amazed that I had did this without borrowing somebody else's ideas or anything like that. I told him this is my own original work. And so he began to respect the fact that I was doing independent work in assessment and analysis. So I would put Obenga on the list as well, because we spent a lot of time together. I'm sorry, brother, I missed part of your question.
Yeah, I was, in summing up, I was just basically saying that can we only imagine the type of artifacts and information and books that might be in somebody's private collection or basement, when we start comparing it to like all the things that are still, not revealed in this states right here, that we still uncovering and learning. Could you imagine back in the time when colonization was going on, they had the freedom to pillage what they want, at that particular time. So, I think those things could shine a light to really to what's going on in history and these conversations that we're having.
Now, that's a great point to bring up because I've gone to as many museum collections around the world dealing with ancient Africa as anybody. I mean, I've studied over 1 million artifacts, and I've also seen so many private collections. And I've
Mm,
always said that there's no because these museums they go back and forth with who has the most important collection. Is it the British Museum in London? Is it the Louvre in Paris? I've gone back and forth to each, spent countless hours, and I don't know who stole more. I don't know if it was the British or the French, but the theft is extensive. And then when I moved back here to the U.S., I went to all of the collections in the U.S. and Canada, making a systematic assessment. And I've seen so many exhibits, and these are private items. Literally, these are private items from private collectors, private families. And I've always said there's no way to know how much they've stolen because you have these private collections around. You see people still selling stuff. And matter of fact, one of the years I brought a group to Kemet or Egypt on an educational tour, and I had a guy that was really excited to be there. So he's with some knucklehead people that had whispered in his ear that they wanted to show him some artifacts. So he told me about it, and I went, and sure enough, they had some crude, clumsy little stuff on a boat that they were showing people with these overpriced items that they claim they got from a tomb. That takes place about a year and a half ago here in the Oakland area. Somebody had contacted me because someone that he knows in the community approached him that he was going to buy, literally, he was going to buy some so called artifacts. I looked at it. I said, well, these are not artifacts. These are made by the hands of modern man. I said, I can tell by the photograph that you text me. I blew it up and I began to point out some rules that there's no way that the artist would have done this or this. They also missed something here, but it's very common even now. And Egypt is making a push to get artifacts returned, but around the world, the collections, they are they're certainly they don't know because if you say that look, this ancestor here, so-called mummy, may be royal. They'll say they don't know because under international law, if it's a royal person, they have to return it. So now they don't know who the names are. That happens at the Rosicrucian Museum here in San Jose. They used to call, the person Usramantu, a priest. Then they did a DNA test with BYU back in the mid 90s. They made big news of it. Now you do the DNA test. Now you don't know who he is. You know who he is. He's probably royal, but they can't say anything about it. So the collections have been very shady and shaky because if they start giving stuff back, then they won't have anything. But the private collectors, that's the area that is more unknown. And there was a book written by Oscar Muscarella, and his book is The Lie Became Great. He's dealing with a lot of forgeries. So when people in their private collections, they have stuff that they bought it's in the family, literally items. And sometimes you see it in a temporary exhibit. And if they don't have the artifacts that they want to sell and make money or whatever they're doing with it, then they'll just create fake and phony items. And the 19th century is the age of fakes. That's when a lot of fakes and phony things were created for two reasons: for commercial reasons to make money and for racial reasons to change the identity and create some non-African looking images. But that's what takes place. But you are absolutely right. In private hands, it is very hard to estimate how much was stolen because people keep it close to them, and you have to be a part of the underground illicit network of people that are selling illicit items that some are authentic. I've seen some of them, and some are just made up in the 19th century or even more modern. And then some collections that are privately owned, they're debated of whether or not they're real. I've looked at over 1 million artifacts in museums in many, many countries. So I always know not only if it has the feel of being authentic or not, but the African ancestors, the artisans followed artistic rules, and because they believed that the rule system was given to them by Ptah, by God. And if the rule system was given to them by the creator, then that means that the rule system had to be correct, the right proportions, the right, the right emblems that are used. This is why somebody who's a layperson, they can look at artifacts from, let's say, Kemet or ancient Egypt, and they know that it's from ancient Egypt because it has a certain look, even to the person who's untrained. But the conspirators, they will mix and mingle authentic stuff with modern nonsense, and the average person won't necessarily be able to tell one from another. But that's what happens. There's a whole culture of this illicit trade that takes place in African artifacts, and people should be aware of that.
Just want to take a second to shout out our brother Asar Imhotep, who is viewing us from Philly. Asar is one of the deepest brothers I know, bar none. And he's among other things, he's a linguist, and he's very much immersed in the study of African history and culture. So shout out to brother Asar Imhotep. Looking forward to having him back on 360 Info Network in the very near future. Brother Manu, I just want to talk to you about this idea of reparations. I think we kind of glanced at it a little bit, but I'm thinking that part of the motivation for them to erase history the way they want to is also to erase their responsibility for making us whole for what we have done for this country and literally what we've done for the world. I mean, this is Black History Month, and we can look over a long list of inventions that we've been responsible for. We could go all the way back to Imhotep creating that theory that Pythagoras was given credit for. Could you talk about the motivation to change history so that they don't take responsibility or accountability for what they've done to us in this country and around the world?
Yeah, that's always an important subject, and I would say that the viewers should and listeners, the viewers should really know there's a difference between reparations, meaning repair damage that's been done and compensate the victims, and repatriation. Repatriation is also associated with this because repatriation means to return artifacts and human remains back to the rightful owners. So that's important as well. But the misrepresentation of the history of the world is linked to that. So they don't have to return the, who am I talking about? The traducers, those that are systematically engaged in mischief and the misrepresentation of history. So you're absolutely right. So they don't have responsibility. But one thing that's happened more recently in the U.S. over the last couple of decades, they recognize that in order to get out of responsibility, we need to do what? Apologize. So people can go online and see that the U.S. has apologized for, for 99 things. But they always have a disclaimer, just like they took Hawaii in 1893 from Liliuokalani. She was in power for 2 years. And then in 1993, on the 100-year anniversary from the theft of Hawaii, the U.S. Congress issued an official apology. It was a great apology. They gave an accurate history of when white men and the missionaries came in and took the land from Liliuokalani and the indigenous Hawaii people. And they gave a great history of how they were independent. The U.S. apologized, a beautiful apology, but the disclaimer was there. This apology is not to settle any claims or to give back the land.
Yeah. Oh man, again, I got to ask a question. Brother, I appreciate your scholarship and your research and your efforts. When you come here to tell my people right now, y'all get your little coins together and help, fund this brother so he can keep doing his research here, because we need people just like you. But most of our people, and in dealing with the media mainstream, the Lewis Gates of the world, the Cornel Wests of the world, those guys that most of us, or most common folk or regular folk look at as our leaders and things like that. But I reflect back to what I believe Brother Malcolm said about letting the enemy teach our children. So it's hard for me to fathom that brothers of that that level, some might call like our brother Carter G. Woodson, or I believe it was him, or Du Bois. Matter of fact, it was Du Bois. They talk about the talented 10. That I can't fathom that they don't know or don't push the importance of us telling our story and the promotion of schools. It's just like you made the analogy about if you study, if our history started in slavery, you're just going to be a good slave. So the importance of us creating our own school and telling our story. I can't fathom that they're not on the bandwagon with that. Yeah, I mean, you ever fathom that, or think about that, or wonder why? Maybe you could explain it to me.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is that, school has been one of those places that have been to control and misrepresent the history as well as the current conditions. This is why the boarding schools are very important in U.S. history. And like one thing that's been very well documented, more than even the black boarding schools, but the Native American boarding schools, where they were forced to send their children to a boarding school. We're talking in the late 1800s. So this was the final way to subdue Native Americans and have them separated from their own history. So the boarding schools are very important. And the idea, the theme was kill the Indian, but save the man. Kill the Indian, but save the man. In other words, kill the quote unquote savage within the person, but keep the physical body around. And if the parents did not send their children to the boarding schools like the Carlisle school, then they were put in prison, literally. And if they didn't want to destroy their children, but these are places that have done great damage. Carter G. Woodson, the great man who's actually the reason for the season in February, he should always be honored. He's a great visionary, educator, and historian. And many people probably know that he wrote over a dozen books. The one that is probably more common or popular with people is The Miseducation of the Negro that he wrote in 1933. And Carter G. Woodson clearly indicates that the same subject, the same materials that empowers the white child, it makes the black child feel inferior because he's always left out. He and she are always the object of somebody else's contempt. They're never the subject of their own story. And so this is why we've had thriving and very important independent schools, independent information, independent teachers. But this changed. It changed, and it really changed big time after the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, where black schools were closed, black teachers didn't have jobs, and we integrated. I was a part of the first group to be bused into actually in San Francisco, it was a school, Jefferson. This was a school with white and pretty much Asian children, and it was all bad for us. And busing was one way. They were never bused into our neighborhoods and schools. We were bused into their areas, their neighborhoods, their schools, and it was all bad. We were automatically seen to be the problem. And if some skirmish broke out on the yard, they didn't never investigate it. Figured you from the Fillmore district, you must be the problem. But we need to have and really value and promote and support the independent schools. We had an independent black school movement to re-educate, reteach. So they were educated. I'm sorry, excuse me. They were independent when during the era of segregation, it was by force. After slavery was over, then it was finally legal for black people to read and write. Or during slavery, if somebody was caught teaching letters, then you will lose a finger, a hand, then you will be publicly beaten. So after slavery was over, and then reading and writing was legalized, these schools were segregated. They were attacked. They were firebombed by the vicious white folks in the North. Not talking about the South, in the North, but the independent schools, they were thriving. At least they were maybe small. They were serving a small population, but at least they were there. You know what? The last thing that was the blow to the independent schools to teach independent knowledge that was of use to our community, teaching useful knowledge. It was when the charter school movement began to take off 2 decades ago. There were independent schools in the CB network, the Council of Independent Black Institutions, or CB, CIBI. Some of them decided that, you know what, it's a challenge to have a school to pay quality teachers a living wage and make sure they have some benefits. So some of them decided to embrace the charter schools because they would have the guaranteed money from the state. But what happened was they got the money from the state, and then many of them, you didn't understand that they also were dictating the curriculum. Now you have to teach towards the state tests, not what you think you want to teach. So this charter school movement, whether it was intended or not so much intended, it's decisions that were made by some folks in the community. I understand the decisions, but the outcome was the breakup of a large part of these independent schools, brother, that would teach the independent insight that comes from those that love the children, and because they were of and from the community. Those days, that's changed these days. Now we have people back in the public school system, which damages black intelligence.
Wow.
Well, brother, we want to be respectful of your time. So I know that you have some events to get to, and brother Hamtonio and I do as well. But I definitely want to make sure that folks are aware of you and what you're doing, and also want to make them aware of the book that you've written. So if you'd like to share the information with them about that book and how they can obtain it.
Okay, thank you very much, bro. I appreciate it. The book is a history of African civilizations, and folks can go directly to our website, advancingtheresearch.org, advancingtheresearch.org, and it's just a small part of what I teach in the classroom, but it's also for the community in general as well. So, and I can't wait to come to Cleveland and look forward to it. The last time I was there was when I was at the Cleveland Art Museum, and this would have been in 1991 that I can remember.
Ooh, my brother, why you staying away so long? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So I look forward to definitely coming back, and then one other thing I know we do have to go is that to the ASALA, Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I'm gonna be frank that folks can do better to follow the tradition of the great Carter G. Woodson, because Woodson focused on Africa. He focused on African civilizations. Last two books were on Africa. The African Background Outline, and then African Heroes and Heroines. Those are his last two books. In fact,
Yeah.
the last three articles he wrote were on Egypt. So throughout all of his scholarship, he's focusing on Black achievements, accomplishments, and contributions to the world. And Woodson challenged people in his day to stick to that and not deal with Black problems and who got beat up, who got slapped by the police, and deal with our humanity and not problems. And then also embrace Africa. This is a theme. And ASALA, if anybody looks at the ASALA national themes, you go back to when the celebration back in 1926, you look from 28 on, there's one theme after another focused on Africa. Where are those days now? So ASALA has an obligation to follow the insight and the pioneering work of its founder. And one last thing, I want to piss them off and challenge them. The Associated Publishers that Woodson created in 1922, he said that to publish our work or publishers' work, he said when you publish the truth, that's self-defense. But yet, what happened a few years ago? They gave up Associated Publishers. So now, if people want to read the journal, they got to go to University of Chicago Press. And I know Woodson would not recognize some of the things that are being done in the name of the organization that he helped create back in 1916. So, folks, I'm sorry, in 1915. So I know there's some good folks that are doing good work, but let's respect Woodson and the vision that he had, and focus on the achievements, the contributions, and look at the independent work that he did that nobody can edit and override because he had his own publishing house. So
yeah.
Thank you.
I also want to amplify the fact that Carter G. Woodson was the impetus behind National Black History Week, but it was students at Kent State University who were responsible for Black History Month. They took it upon themselves to speak to Dr. Edward W. Crosby, who at the time was over a department called the Institute of African American Affairs. They also had a conversation with Dean Milton Wilson, who took their comments and their concerns to the university administration. A year later, in 1970, Kent State University began observing Black History Month. And then 6 years later, President Gerald R. Ford made it official for the entire country. So Big ups to Carter G. Woodson. Big ups to the students at Kent State University. Brother Hamtonio, you're bringing Professor Ampim here to Cleveland next month. You want to give them the details before we conclude?
Yeah, we're nailing down the Wings Academy there on Prospect. So March 16th, the lecture start about 2 to 3 o'clock. We have more details. Brother Pim would be on March 2nd. But you can give me a call, 216-323-6155 to reserve your tickets so we can make this happen. And again, I'll be, I guess introducing, the new catering company that we'll be starting to, West African Food. So we're gonna call the lecture Food for Thought, given by the Truth series as well. So come on out. So after the lecture, we get a chance to engage in a little of our culture through food. After we've got our nourishment with the mental and spiritual thing that Brother Pam was going to bring. We're going to talk a little bit about the Willie Lynch situation over there, his research with the Willie Lynch papers. And I asked her also to talk about some of the African spiritual systems, initiations that go on over there. And that like my brother Charles French said, hey, you're not truly African until you go through the initiation system. So we're going to talk about that as well. So it's going to be a great event. I know you guys might have wanted something in February, but guess what? We're going to give you a power pack presentation in March. So March 16th, probably be at Wings Academy. We'll give you more detail. Tickets might be about $15, includes the sampling. So give me a call, 216-323-6155.
In conclusion, I would just like to honor the fact that to those who wish to oppress us, the most dangerous folks on the planet are brothers like Professor Manu Ampim. Knowledge is power, and you execute it wisely, my brother. My kudos to you. Continue to do what you do. And we will continue to ask folks who are watching us on this program, like, comment, and subscribe. Empower us as well. As always, know yourself, love yourself, be yourself. Make today your absolute best day. Peace, everyone.
Peace.
Thank you, brothers. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Second